Well, good afternoon and welcome to a new session of our workshop on social theory with a focus on Latin American, but not only Latin American capitalism, which we have been developing for almost a year, not yet, but maybe in the next future. And we are delighted with the positive reception it has received from the public. And we are, of course, grateful and very happy for your presence in this occasion. The moderation and presentation of our great guests will be handled by Rommy. And yeah, I encourage everybody to take part afterwards on the discussion, making questions or comments and having fun. Then I would like to give you the word, Rommy, and yeah. You have to turn on the microphone. And just an invitation for everybody to put on your cameras if you can, just to make this fiction of presence talking a bit more real. Yeah? If you can, it's nice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rafa. Today I are very excited because the presenter is from Professor Peter Wagner. Peter Wagner is a professor from Barcelona University in the Department of Sociology. His trajectory is very, very long, related with the modernity topics. He started with the famous book about modernity in 1994, 1992, approx. And after that, he continued developing the social theory about modernity, and in the last 10 years, starting talking and thinking in the modernities. And he's included in his work, in his research, the global South. I am very excited too because Peter Wagner was my director in my PhD thesis, and obviously he have a lot influence in my line of research currently. Peter have different a lot literature, a lot papers, a lot books, but I would like to remark the more famous research, because it was a very big research, empirical one, on RSA Advanced Grant from the European funded. The name was TRAMOD, Trajectories of Modernity, comparing European and non-European varieties. In this project, Peter Wagner started to develop the theory from different places in the global South. Brazil, South Africa, Greece, Spain, Catalonia, Chile included. And I think from this project appeared different problematics, and he was continue working about in currently, especially in the ecological problem in the global capitalism. Peter Wagner have a very big trajectory related with the guidance of important theses in the Department of Sociology in Barcelona, in different European universities. And I think I don't need to say so much about his trajectory, but I am very grateful to have the opportunity to present his job in this seminar, because I think it's the opportunity to think from the concept in the Wagner theory related with the more empirical dimension in the global South, especially in Latin America. For this reason, I would like to give rapidly the floor to the Professor Peter Wagner, and thank you very much, Peter, for coming to the seminar.
Thank you very much, Rommy and Rafael, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk with you today, and thank you, Rommy, for the very kind and overly generous presentation. Maybe let me start by saying a bit something about the frame of the presentation today with a slightly wordy title which I've given to it. So this is meant to be an exploration which connects world history with social theory, and world history or global history or planetary history, as some people call it now, with the assumption being that historians, when they do global history, they very often just collect data over wider spaces than national historians used to do, but often do not develop very clearly a conceptual perspective on it. Whereas social theorists often have the inclination to talk about society and social transformations without a closer look at historical changes and historical transformations. So I will basically try to make an argument that these two aspects have to be kept together, that historical investigation has to be linked to social theoretical investigation. Having said that, then first, in the sense of first choice or first thought has to be spent on the question of how broadly we conceptualize organized social life on the globe. And there are basically two options which are very well known. The one is to look at the globe as composed of different societies and states, which are basically separate from each other and have their own separate trajectories. This is most common in modernization theory from the 1950s and 1960s onwards, or neo-modernization theory today. And the alternative to that is to look at the globe as basically interconnected, that there are indeed no entirely separate and independent entities, but there are always relations between them. And these relations are not necessarily symmetrical. They are often asymmetrical relations, relations of power differences, in various forms of power. It can be political power, as in colonialism, or it can be economic power, as in a global capitalist market. And so one has to, it seems clear, I think from recent debate, that the second perspective is preferable over the first. But saying that, one should not overlook that states are containers of agency, that states are actors, whereas connections cannot easily be thought of as acting. And secondly, states and societies are also containers of communication. Despite current global communication networks, there are clusters of communication that are located in societies. So this is an important precondition to be able to detect plurality and diversity and to locate hierarchies and asymmetries more clearly. And a third aspect that is related to the first term in my title, the fossil fuels, one can also think that there is a basic distinction between socio-historical or historical and social theoretical perspectives that either focus on material aspects, maybe most strongly in historical materialism, but nowadays also in the so-called new materialism, which indeed looks at matter, at resources, biophysical resources, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a perspective that looks at ways in which human social life is organized according to certain principles. Modernity is often assumed to be based on principles of autonomy and rational mastery, and one can also assume that these ideas are driving forces of history. So what I will try to convey today is a perspective that combines these two elements, if you want, a material ideational perspective on global history. So this is all a bit of a mouthful, and trying to do this in half an hour or a bit more, I want to, on the one hand, develop a long-term perspective, so not renounce on long historical duration, but on the other hand, focus, to be able to be precise, to focus on a limited set of elements. And having said that, I will now try, with all my technical incompetence, to share the screen. I think it has already gotten slightly wrong because what I would like to put on the screen is not there. but I'll try again. Just 1 second. Now this should work out, I hope. Can you now see a diagram?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So so I will talk about fossil fuels overall, and you will be very familiar with that debate overall. One way of seeing the effects of fossil fuel use by human societies is to look at carbon dioxide emissions, and as a consequence, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So this is a very long perspective. You see in the first diagram, you will all have seen versions of that. What you see there is basically not quite, there are 2,000 years missing or so, but you see the Holocene, the past 12,000 years of human history. And you see that there has been a relatively great degree of stability in the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, whereas there is a huge surge in the recent past. So this recent past is then known as the Anthropocene, as geologists have proposed to say, even though they have finally not agreed on that term. But the assumption which remains valid is that in the very recent past, it is human action that has had a considerable impact on the condition of the planet. And one way of measuring that is the global atmospheric CO2 concentration. I will say very little about the first 10,000 years in this diagram, but concentrate on the past 500, more or less. This is basically the same diagram, only limited to the past 500 years. And what you can see here as well is that the carbon dioxide concentration has remained stable over the 3 centuries from roughly 1500 to roughly 1800. And it only rises from the early 19th century onwards. Now, you will see, actually, I will show you a lot of data. This is a very empirical presentation for a social theory seminar, but I think you'll probably we'll see what I'm getting at. Because now if we look at this diagram only, we can reflect a moment about the ways in which one can generally, or in which this generally has been explained in terms broadly of social theory, understanding the social very widely. And there are basically 3 such explanations. The first is maybe more a biological demographic explanation, but it's social in the broader sense of the term, which namely relates the human impact on the planet to the number of human beings on the Earth, to population size. And if you take a first look at the data, there is some, or also at the concept, there is some plausibility to it, because human beings need resources from non-human nature. And so it's quite straightforward to assume that the more human beings there are, the more resources they will need. And indeed, one can develop, I will not show you that, but one can show a graphics of the development of the world population, which you can match very neatly on this graphic here. So if you just take the latter part, there were roughly 1 billion human beings on the Earth at 1800, and now there are 8 billion, and the rise is indeed relatively contained in the 19th century, and it accelerates considerably in the 20th century, and even more so in the second half of the 20th century. So the match is almost perfect. So that makes some people argue that there is indeed a close correlation here, and that's the core of the problem. Well, at a closer look, this is patently not true, because if you just look at the second half of the 20th century, where the major rise in CO2 concentration happens and population increases, the use of fossil fuels, so the emission of carbon dioxide, mostly happens in societies of the Northwest in this, and most of the second part of the 20th century. And these are basically societies stagnating in terms of population. They hardly grow any longer. whereas population grows enormously in the global south overall, but especially in Africa and South and Southeast Asia, where most of the people hardly emit any carbon dioxide. So even though there is, at a first look, some correlation, at a closer look, there is none at all. I would just leave this theory aside, even though you will encounter it very often when there is talk about the human impact on the planet. So let me move to the other two theories. The one is indeed related to some concept of modernity. Some of you will know the South Asian historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, who, after having looked at the impact of colonial capitalism on India under British rule, has been part of the subaltern historical scholarship on South Asia, has more recently, in the past 15 years, taken a closer look at climate change. And there is one sentence of his which is very often quoted, where he says that the mention of human freedoms is built on an ever-expanding foundation of fossil fuels. So he makes a rather direct connection between freedom and fossil fuel use, which is very provocative, especially for a critical historian. So what's the argument here, really? The argument is that he goes back basically to the Enlightenment, where in West European debate, human freedom is posited, human autonomy, and that also means autonomy over nature, which is the, you could say, ideational precondition for the exploitation of nature as we have come to know it over the past centuries. Still, it's not entirely straightforward, because if human beings are free and autonomous, it doesn't follow necessarily that they will exploit nature. One can think of freedom and autonomy differently. So there has indeed recently been a French philosopher and historian, Pierre Charbonnier, who has connected this argument to material well-being. He has said the idea of freedom only became convincing when it was connected to the promise of wealth and affluence. There's a book called Freedom and Affluence. So he connects, you could say, freedom and increase of comfort as driving forces of human history, and then suggests that this explains the rising curve over the past 2 centuries. You could say that a key, which is actually the case for Charbonnier and indirectly also for Chakrabarty, that a key reference for this is classical political economy, and especially Adam Smith, where his most famous book, The Wealth of Nations, indeed seems to connect this argument that free human action on markets and a specialization in the division of labor increases the wealth of nations through more efficient production, basically. Of course, Smith is also, you could say, at the origins indirectly of the third explanation, namely not through himself, but through the critique of political economy as developed by Marx, where not striving for freedom and comfort, but striving for profit is the main driving force of history. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that argument, because this is a seminar series on capitalism. So I don't need to say much more about that. Just to point out that in contrast to the population theory, the explanation through modernity, freedom and comfort, and the explanation through capitalism and profit, they are quite well located with the evidence on carbon dioxide concentration, because the onset of modernity is often seen as dated to the revolutions of the late 18th century, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Declaration of Independence of the 13 colonies in North America. And the origins of modern capitalism, at least, are related to the Industrial Revolution, which begins at roughly the same time, maybe slightly later in the early 19th century. I'll come back to that. That seems, both of these theories, even though they are somewhat competitive with each other, they are well located on this timeline of the empirical rise of CO2 concentration. But before saying more about that, let me raise one question which has some importance for our discussion. Namely, if that is the case, what do we do? How do we conceptualize the development from roughly 1500 to 1800? This is known for historians of Europe as early modernity. It's also the period of increasing outreach from Europe through other world regions, through maritime trade and through colonial settlements. And it is, as world systems theorists see it, the creation of a world economic system, a interconnected world economy. But regarding carbon dioxide concentration, we don't see any effect of this, of the economic and political transformations in these 3 centuries. Now, I will make a more systematic argument about that in a moment, but I just want to direct your attention to the slight drop in carbon dioxide concentration at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. I think you can see that. It may not be very profound, but it's visible. It's clearly identifiable. Now, what has happened there, one may want to ask. And there are indeed 2 explanations for this. And I think our evidence is not good enough to really decide which one is more valid. They can also be combined. But I think they open up 2 different perspectives. The one is that this drop is related to what is known as the Little Ice Age, which it's stated in different ways, but that is, so to say, the core period of the Little Ice Age. It is known, it is measurable that it has happened very strongly in the Northern Hemisphere, but most scholars in that area, they think it was a global phenomenon, only that we have less data about the Southern Hemisphere in that period. And that means that because of general cooling, not induced by human beings, but by some planetary phenomena like changing solar activity or volcano activity, several hypotheses. Indeed, the carbon dioxide concentration was reduced in this period. So that would show that indeed there can be planetary changes that have an impact on human life on the Earth, because this had a considerable impact. There were bad harvests, and as a consequence, rebellions and famines, warfare. So planetary changes to which humans have not contributed may well have an impact on human social life. That's one explanation. The other explanation, though, is that what we see here is the impact of the arrival of Europeans in America. And the explanation is that within a relatively short period, the population of America was reduced by 95%. Through diseases, through colonial violence, and a combination of the 2 worsening living conditions. This population figure is relatively certain. Again, there is a problem with the information we have, but it's relatively certain. Whether it can really have had that impact is contested. That is less certain. But it would mean, and that is, for instance, known for the Amazon, to which I will come back later on as well, that the region of the Amazon was relatively densely populated before European arrivals, and that this population was dying very quickly, like in other parts of America, and the forest regrew there where plantations existed. So the reforestation, which happened due to the decrease of the population, may have had an impact on the global atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. So here you have the opposite impact. Here you indeed see human activity unintentionally having an enormous impact on the planetary condition, even early, relatively early in human history. I'll leave this. This is ongoing research, and one doesn't know for sure which explanation is more powerful than the other. And as I said at the beginning, they can also be combined, but you see here that these 2 elements can indeed come together. Let me maybe move on. No, let me try to connect these 2 diagrams. Let me just say about this diagram, and then I will jump back for a moment. This is now, and I will continue in this way, a closer look at the period around 1800. I've chosen 2 dates here. 1784 is the year in which the improved version of the steam engine by James Watt was patented. and 1848 is the year of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. So that's the period I've selected out here. But let me just quickly hop back and say that, so this is a zoom on the period, which here is only part of the larger diagram, but it is that period in which the curve starts to rise. So we have here, with the kind of evidence I have selected, a world historical transformation. And the question is, how should we understand that really? And let me give you a proposal for an explanation. Obviously, what is stable here until from 1500 to 1800 is hiding major changes in terms of, indeed, the impact of the maritime trade expansion of Europeans, which means an enormous transfer of resources from other world regions to Europe. It means also new forms of production, like the plantation economy with slave labor. It also means what has been called the Columbian Exchange, that indeed organic products that did not exist in the old world were moved there and the other way around, so that the basis for food and nutrition changed in both parts of the world. So there are enormous changes here, and they have had they were asymmetric. So clearly the Europeans, especially the West Europeans, benefited considerably from it, and the import of certain kinds of products like coffee and tobacco, they may have had an impact on what early modern economic historians call the industrious revolution, namely that in Western Europe, especially in Great Britain and the Netherlands, labor activity increased, and it also moved into households, so that a new form of society was emerging, which was more productive than earlier European societies, through internal changes, because it meant different attitudes of human beings to work. But it was also feeding on the exchange with other world regions, which benefited Europe. Now, arguably, and now I jump ahead to the other diagram again, what happened was that these developments, they led to, especially the Netherlands and again Great Britain, to become the richest societies in the world. They benefited from their respective East Asia trading companies, and they generated this wealth and increased also their own domestic activity. Now, what happened in these societies is that they reached a limit. Maybe very well known is Thomas Robert Malthus' argument about a population crisis, namely that the land could not feed any longer the population that lives on it. But maybe more important is the debate which happened in many West European societies in the late 18th century about what was called the wood shortage. Actually, the term sustainability in German was coined in the late 18th century with regard to forest management, because you couldn't cut down more wood. You had to manage wood. You had to regrow trees to such a degree that the cutting of trees would not lead to decreasing forest sizes. This was actually not a shortage in the strict sense of the term, but wood became more expensive. It had to be imported from Eastern Europe or from Northern Europe to the centers of activity in West Europe. And this was talked about as a wood shortage, but that's an economic term, not a biophysical term. And as a consequence, what took place in England, and in England only, was the transgression of what I call the first vertical frontier. I use the term frontier in terms of expansion of human activities beyond what was before recognized as limits. The maritime expansion is a horizontal frontier 3 centuries earlier, but the deep mining of coal which accelerates from roughly 1800s onwards, and that you see clearly in the diagram, is the transgression of a first vertical frontier, the mining of fossil fuels, which is closely related to the steam engine in the sense that, especially in England, where they had deposits of coal also close to the surface, coal was already used more intensely in the whole 18th century and even a bit before, but mostly for as thermal energy, for heating and for smithery. With the steam engine, you could use coal for mechanical energy. Actually, in the beginning, mostly to pump the water out of the mines, which allows deeper mining of coal. This accelerates quickly, and with the use of coal in the steam engine for mechanical energy, you can increase the production of iron and steel, and you can develop the new technology, especially the railways, which emerged in that period. Now, what I want to underline here is, first of all, that this is not driven by any of the logics I've mentioned before, population, freedom and comfort, or profit. It's problem-driven. The societies, especially Britain and the Netherlands, who had this high intensity of activity, reached a limit, and they reached the limit of the organic economy that existed before. And this organic economy, as you saw in the prior diagram, is relatively stable in terms of fossil fuels, at least. But it reaches this limit in this period. And the transgression of this frontier allows then further development. But it allows it only where the conditions for that are given. And that's why it only starts in the United Kingdom. I've introduced in this diagram the Netherlands, where we don't really have good data. So they don't reach as far back as for the United Kingdom. But the Netherlands normally, if this were just logic-driven by freedom, comfort, or profit, then this could as well have happened in the Netherlands. But in the Netherlands, there is no coal. The Netherlands' organic economy was working with peat, and there are no coal deposits. So this acceleration could only take place contingently in the United Kingdom. And once in the United Kingdom, the deep mining of coal with the help of steam engines was developed, then other countries could imitate that. And the other two main cases are the United States and Germany, but later in the 19th century. And compared to the UK, you see at a much lower level. So what I want to suggest, and that is overall the way of reading history, which I want to propose to you, is that rather than driven by a logic which leads to a certain end, like global capitalism fully developed, or like modernization, which has global reach, we rather see a development that is driven by problems that societies are facing at a certain point. And here we also come back to the argument about freedom, which I was mentioning before. I will do this briefly because I will be speaking for too long otherwise. But some of you may be well aware that the 17th and 18th century were intellectually, ideationally, a period in which, on the one hand, political economy developed, like with Adam Smith. On the other hand, social contract theory with John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So this was a society, if you put these two theories together, which one can call, they were based on commercial republicanism. They were based on freedom in this sense, freedom of market actors and freedom of political communication, even though this clearly not based on equal universal suffrage, but in an oligarchic way. So these were societies based on freedom, but they had a constraint. The constraint was the land constraint, which they only overcame with the transgression of the first vertical frontier. We can discuss this in more detail later. I will just move ahead because otherwise I won't be getting to the present in the end, and I would like to. Now, this diagram is more or less the one that follows. Here again, I've tried to choose two somewhat specific dates. The first is 1870, maybe not that specific, but this is the period in which nation states consolidate in Europe. You have the Third Republic in France, you have the so-called unification of Germany and Italy. So that is to some extent a political rupture, and 1929 is the date of the Great Depression, starting in the US but expanding across the whole Western world. Now, what you see here, and the first half of the diagram from 1870 to, let's say, 1910, or the First World War, that is sometimes also called the period of the Second Industrial Revolution, the period of organized capitalism, especially in Germany and the US. And here you see, especially in the US and in Germany, an acceleration of fossil fuel use visible in carbon dioxide emissions. In the United Kingdom, much less, because it was already at a relatively high level. The British society didn't industrialize much further, not compared with the United States and Germany. It was indeed, you see, overtaken in carbon dioxide emissions by Germany at the time of the First World War, basically. Now, this period marks the beginning of the transgression of the second vertical frontier, which is oil and gas exploration. This starts in the United States and actually in Russia, today Azerbaijan, in Baku, where oil was first found and explored. Some of you may have seen The Killing of the Flower Moon, the latest Scorsese movie, which tells the story of the US in the early 20th century related to the profits from oil exploration. But this is so it's a new development which goes beyond the use of coal. Again, much more can be said about that. But what I want to suggest for the time being is that in the late 19th, early 20th century, this doesn't actually lead to a major change in European societies. You can see that the curves for Germany and the United Kingdom, they show ups and downs, and they're also more or less flatlining. There is not much further increase in the 20th century after the increase in Germany in the late 19th century. But there is increase in the US. I think this has a particular reason, which is related to the new self-understanding of 19th century societies after industrialization with coal. Namely that rather than spreading freedom and comfort, these became strongly divided societies, where on the one hand, there was an imperial industrial oligarchy, which was praising the industrial accomplishments and European colonial world domination, but at the same time, decreasing living conditions and working conditions for large parts of the population, especially in the urban settings and the industrial work sites. Which means that the self-understanding of these societies was also divided. There were the oligarchic imperial elites, which had one vision of how society should develop further, and they were opposed by the workers and the women's movement, who were mobilizing the political imaginary that comes out of the late 18th century revolutions in terms of freedom and equality and calls for democracy, which were not at all realized in the 19th century. So these are divided societies, and you have a stronger social transformation in the US than in Europe, where there is a blockade, because on the one hand, the elites did not renounce their privileges, but the protest movements were not strong enough to impose themselves. Now I want to make a digression. Let me see where we are. And for that, I need to introduce another aspect, because what you have seen, first we have seen carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and in the preceding two slides, carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels. So this is basically coal and oil extraction and burning and the industrial use of it. But until 1940, basically, the major part of carbon dioxide emissions globally comes from changes in land use. Changes in land use, the technical term here, basically means deforestation or reforestation. And this provides world regionally a completely different picture. Here, this graph goes from the middle of the 19th century to the present. And I should explain the presentation. You see, for instance, that mostly for Germany, but also for some other countries slightly, there is a negative development. That basically means reforestation. And negative emissions means that plants capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this is what happens all the time, but normally in the recent past, this is way outdone by the carbon dioxide emissions that come from deforestations or from industrial use. Now, what I want to show you here is that you have for some countries, and I picked several Latin American countries, but I singled out Brazil and Indonesia, which show very strong developments, which are related to deforestation. You see also, you can see, for instance, we have to take a closer look. For Argentina, this is also significant for the period from 1900 to 1940, but much less afterwards. Whereas in Indonesia, it starts earlier, and in Brazil, you can see rather clearly the impact of the deforestation of the Amazon. But you can also see more hopefully the effect of the Lula governments in the early 2000s with a rather radical decline of emissions from land use change. Now, I will do this very quickly just to show you these are the same countries, but now we have fossil fuel and industry and land use change combined. And what is striking here is, and that is very often not in the focus of current debates, well, sometimes it is that land use change remains a very important component of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere due to deforestation. You see here that, and always keep in mind, this is now burning of fossil fuels, industrial use of fossil fuels, and land use change combined. Then some industrial countries like Germany and the United Kingdom, they are actually less significant than Indonesia and Brazil, where the land use change remained significant until the present. Well, I should say one word about why it's not significant in Europe, and that is because Europe has been deforested before 1800. The whole debate about wood shortage is related to that basically, at least in all of Western Europe, there already were no longer forests that could capture carbon dioxide to a large degree. So there is one of the asymmetrical relations you see there that, which in this case actually shows that the fossil fuel use in industrialized countries can be less significant than the land use change in, let's say, semi-industrialized countries, or however you want to call Indonesia and Brazil, where land use change remains significant. I will just complicate this picture one step further. Or let me see. No, here we are, I think. Because, wait. Yes, this is basically the same diagram, only starting in 1900, but I've introduced the United States. And this is now again, first only land use change. And there you see that in the second half of the 20th century, the land use change in the US is insignificant. It's sometimes even negative due to sequestering of carbon dioxide through forests. But you have from 1900 to 1940, or the middle of the 20th century, a significant component of land use change in the US as well. And this is basically the transformation of the Midwest in the US, the cutting down of forests and the creation of agricultural and pasture land in the Midwest, Western US, which led to the Dust Bowl phenomenon, namely the desertification of part of this land due to the cutting of forests. But this is, and there you see the timeline that what happened in Europe before 1800 happens in the US until the middle of the 20th century, and it goes on happening in countries like Brazil and Indonesia today. So this is in a sense, a digression from the main line of my argument, but to show that the asymmetries and the rather complex interconnections between various societies you see more clearly on a more nuanced way if you do not look only at fossil fuels, but also at land use change. Now back to the main argument and back to carbon dioxide emissions only from fossil fuels and industry. As I said before, from 1940, globally speaking, indeed, land use change becomes less important, even though we have seen that in parts of the global south, it remains very significant. What we see here, basically, if you just focus on the year 1945, the end of the Second World War, that after that, the carbon dioxide emissions increase significantly in the US and European Union 27, that's the current European Union, so it includes large chunks of Eastern Europe. It does not include any longer the United Kingdom, which is listed separately below. So this, some of you may know, many of you will know, this has recently been called the Great Acceleration, not only of fossil fuel use, but of the use of many kinds of resources and their impact, including loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, and other related ecological phenomena. So this is, and this graph goes from the Great Depression to 1972, and I will say a word about 1972 in a moment. So this has been called the Great Acceleration, but I think it should be called the Western Great Acceleration, because outside the West, very little happens. You see already growth in China, but still relatively limited, and much less in a big country like India, to which we also will come back in a moment. Now, what explains this? Again, you could say that this is simply a new stage in profit-seeking, or the new stage in comfort-seeking. It's certainly not, I said that at the beginning, related to population, because the populations of the US and Europe don't grow significantly already in this period. But I think the argument is too simple if put like that. Whether you put the blame on capitalism or on modernity, you have to take a closer look. And I want to spend 2 minutes on this, basically with two sources, the authors of which you will probably recognize. The first is Josef Schumpeter, an economist, Austrian-born, or born in the Habsburg Empire. He, and that is important, he was already active at the end of the First World War, so he experienced the attempts at a socialist revolution in Europe, and the failure of these revolutions. He noticed the rise of the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution. And then later he migrated to the US. And in 1942, he wrote probably his most famous book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which is referred to for several reasons. But I only want to refer to one argument which is often overlooked, because he's quite explicit, writing in 1942 and amending the argument in 1946 after the end of the World War and the defeat of Nazism, saying that in Europe and up to that time, and basically in the terms in which I've used before, he's quite explicit about that, said the capitalist order was neither capable nor willing to provide for a decent way of living for the whole of society, neither capable nor willing. And that is why the calls for a socialist revolution were arising in Europe in the beginning of the 20th century. But he says, and now he's in the US and is looking what's happening in the US, he sees that in the US, an answer to this question has been found, in which the elites, the power holders, do not have to relinquish their privileges, but at the same time can provide for a decent living of the whole population, so making social revolution unnecessary, actually having greater social benefits than any socialist revolution could ever have. This is in the Second World War and slightly after the end of it with the revised edition. And basically, a few years later, well, 15 years later, the same Martin Lipset, maybe one of the most well-known political sociologists of the second half of the 20th century, writes his by now canonical article on the social requisites of democracy. And again, you may know that also because those of you who are Latin Americans, he devotes quite some time to Latin America. And it is an argument, it's a comparative analysis in an early form, much copied and supposedly improved later on the social requisites, the conditions under which democracy can flourish. It has become part of modernization theory, but he is quite explicit in saying that he is comparing what he calls stable democracies, unstable democracies, and dictatorships. These are the categories he uses. And he says if you look at several indicators, then stable democracies, I'll only single out one, or the stability of democracies depends very much on the use of coal per capita of the population. So the use of energy is seen, fossil fuel energy, is seen as a precondition for consolidating democracy. And you could say by 1959, he's basically just describing what has been done in the US and what has been transported to Europe, even though much less to other parts of the world, and not to Latin America either, namely to stabilize democracy, to subvert the request for a more profound transformation of society by spending energy. I mean, of course, the main example is the combustion engine and Henry Ford's both changes in production and changes in workers' pay, which allowed workers to buy the products of their own work, which led to the label Fordism, which Antonio Gramsci gave to this new kind of capitalism, which basically invested fossil fuels to pacify desires for a stronger social transformation. I say this did not happen. This emerged in the US. It was transported to Europe, not least in the Cold War context and the fear that the Soviet Union could be a model for transformation of European societies, but much less to Latin America, where, as we all know, there was no concern about stabilizing dictatorships instead of trying to develop democracy with the support of the US. Now, I lead this diagram until 1972 because that's important in our current debates. People who talk about the Great Acceleration, they tend to argue that this Great Acceleration basically continues until the present. But at a closer look, this is not entirely true. Or again, to put it in the terms which I'm using all the time, one has to make world regional differentiations. And the turning point here is the early 1970s, to some extent indeed 1972, because again, you may all have heard the term polycrisis or multiple crisis for our current situation. Well, I'd suggest that a true polycrisis happened in the early 1970s for Western capitalism, because this was basically, the term has been used only later. This was the model of democratic capitalism, supposed model of democratic capitalism, which made capitalism compatible with democracy and which was hailed as such. But this democratic capitalism faced this polycrisis in 1972. The components were unrest within Western societies, both by students and workers, against the meaninglessness of life in standardized industrial society, including further calls for stabilization and improvement of material well-being, even though that was in the West already at a rather high level. 1972 is the year of the publication of the Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, which pointed to the exhaustion of natural resources, not least oil. And the early 1970s are the years of the debate about a new international economic order, with demand by third world countries to be in control of their own resources, actually approved by the United Nations in 1974, but never implemented. And 1973, we are all reminded of that in these days, was the year of the Yom Kippur War and the so-called oil crisis, the increase in the price of oil by the Arab oil exporting countries. So this is a polycrisis, and what happened then? What happened can basically be seen here, or the outcome of what happened. What Western elites did, they recognized this challenge, maybe not always in a very clear-sighted way, but they recognized in particular the two domestic pressures. The one was the social pressure for, you could say, greater liberty and self-realization with continued social policies on the one side, and the rising ecological movements on the other side. Now, the response to that was delocalization of industries, of economic sectors with high environmental pollution and with strong need for an organized labor force. So by allowing companies to relocate the strongholds of industrial society, in particular to East Asia, the Western elites tried to deal with these two core aspects of the problem, the ecological and the social aspect. And they indeed, they dealt with the social aspect in two ways. On the one hand, they weakened the workers' movement because there was less demand for work and rising unemployment. At the same time, consumer products were now produced in East Asia at lower prices. So mass consumption could continue, even though it was no longer produced in Europe. So we have here this different picture where the rising curves of carbon dioxide emissions, they exist mostly in China and increasingly slightly later in India, whereas in the United States and in Europe, they are declining, not only only stabilizing, but even declining. This leads to a different distribution by world region, where you can see that until 1950, almost all carbon dioxide emissions come from the United States. And here we have the European Union 27 without the UK, and the Europe without the EU, that is basically Great Britain. If you take these two bottom colors together, you have almost 100% of the carbon dioxide emissions. There's almost nothing in the rest of the world. But by the present, this has changed considerably. We have decreasing carbon dioxide emissions in these formerly core countries, and we have increasing emissions, especially in China and India. Now, because I know you will be asking that, these are all aggregate emissions for countries. If you look at per capita emissions, the picture is still considerably different, where the United States population has almost double the carbon dioxide emissions per capita than any other European countries, even including China and including the European Union. But even the Chinese per capita emissions are also considerably increasing, and the Indian ones as well, whereas those in Latin America, they are fluctuating somewhat, but not changing considerably. Now, I've reached the end of the presentation, and just want to conclude briefly, if I have a few minutes. I've been talking for too long, maybe, but you haven't told me. So let me just conclude a bit. You know, one could argue now that these three explanations, which I started out from, that they retain some validity, because, I mean, the population has been increasing, the comfort has been increasing, the material well-being, even though very unevenly across the globe, and profit-seeking clearly is still a dominant motive for many economic actors. But what I'm trying to propose to you is a different angle, not to assume that any of these logics is just prevailing as such, as if it were a logic that imposes itself on world history, but rather that aspects of these logics, they emerge at particular critical junctures when societies face problems that they need to address. And of course, they don't address them necessarily equally and democratically. They always address them under conditions of power hierarchies in societies and between societies. But these crisis moments are always moments of contingency, where different outcomes are possible, different courses of action can be taken. And that leads then to a view of world history as much less linear and driven by a single logic, but as a series of world historical transformations, which are all crisis moments. And in my last sentence, I just summarize them. There is one of those at around 1800, with the crisis of the advanced organic economy and commercial republicanism, with its core in Western Europe, but with colonial impact. There is one in the 1920s and 1930s, which is the stagnation in European societies, which leads to the political breakdown and the rise of totalitarianism, which then leads to the conclusion after the war that one needs to consolidate democracy. That is done through fossil fuels, basically through oil, but that reaches its limit in the early 1970s with the limits to growth debate and these aspects I've been mentioning. And the last crisis arrives in the 1990s, where what I call the third vertical frontier is transgressed, well, from the 1970s onwards, and that is namely the enrichment of the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, which leads to the climate change emergency which we face today. Well, that was my last sentence, so I thank you for your attention, and I'm curious to listen to your comments and observations.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for your fascinating presentation. Now we open the floor to the audience. I don't know if any participant have questions.
You can put up your hands in the digital way, or just write something in.
And let me maybe just say again, no problem with Spanish, Castellano, so please go ahead. If you feel more comfortable with that, it's no problem for me.
We have some questions from the previous formulary. The people sent the question before the seminar, and maybe we can say. Yeah, normally the questions are or very abstract or very political one, but in this case, for example, the question is, estimado expositoras, a partir de su exposición, ¿qué podría decirse de los escenarios futuros o energy futures en América Latina? La pregunta Joaquín Sepúlveda, de la Universidad de la Frontera.
Do you want me to try to respond?
A ver, un segundo. Sí, porque las otras son diferentes, sí.
Okay, yeah, let me try. Let me start by the end of my argument, because you could say what we have here is three main questions that are connected. There is the ecological question, which in a sense I've put in the foreground with what overall is an argument about the ecological emergency we face now with climate change. But in the background of that is the social question. And I've tried to suggest that indeed the ecological question emerges because of the attempt to answer the social question with the use of fossil fuels in the West after the Second World War. And that in the context of democracy, you could say some kind of formal procedural democracy, but democracy. Now, the Latin American situation is different in several respects. First of all, the elites after the Second World War, they were worried about the political situation in Western Europe in the Cold War context. They were not worried about, and I say the elites in general, including the Latin American elites, they were not worried about democracy in Latin America. They were very often quite comfortable with having authoritarian governments or military dictatorships in Latin America, and which allowed to avoid answering the social question. to keep a strong degree of social inequality in Latin America, even though social inequality decreased in Western Europe at the same point in time. This also means that the ecological impact is less pronounced in Latin America in that period, let's say in the first 3 decades after the Second World War. Now, what we have now is a situation in which the ways the Western countries try to solve the ecological question puts an ecological burden on other world regions, including Latin America. The Amazon question is a central aspect there, but also the new forms of extractionism. So what I think the answer there is, the overall question is to find an answer to the social question which is compatible with the ecological question. And to some extent, you could say the chances for that in Latin America would be bigger than they are if there were more control of their own situation than there is. So I think the overall answer is to strengthen democracy and collective self-determination in Latin America with a view to developing their own ways of solving the social and ecological question, and not doing that in dependence from the way Western societies try to solve that question. I hope that says something. Maybe it's a bit abstract, but maybe it says something at least.
Thank you, Peter. I don't see yes, I have one question, and Rafa have one question too. Rafa, puedes hacerla si quieres.
Sí. Well, I will try to make the first example for the people who do want to make a question in Spanish, and I will go for it. Bien, muchísimas gracias por la exposición, me encantó. Tengo una pregunta general, tengo 2 preguntas básicamente. Una es por la desigualdad dentro de la desigualdad en la emisión de CO2. Es decir, uno puede observar diferentes trends en Europa o, como mostrabas, con el uso del suelo en las periferias, digamos, de la sociedad mundial. Y la pregunta es si es que has notado una lógica de desigualdad dentro de la desigualdad, por ejemplo, en Europa, de manera de observar cómo dentro de la misma comunidad europea o dentro de Gran Bretaña se han ido generando, para ponerlo en la forma en la que yo estoy investigando, lógicas de concentración interna, ¿no? De manera de que no es toda la región europea, no es toda Gran Bretaña, no es toda Alemania en este caso, el que genera la emisión de CO2, sino que grupos en las cuales toman muy pocos grupos de personas toman parte y generan este tipo de emisiones, ya sea por concentración industrial, de negocios, etcétera, 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 ¿no? La primera es un poco si es que es posible poner un ojo clínico a esa desigualdad interna dentro de esta gran región. Y la segunda pregunta sería por el otro lado de la distinción. Tenemos la emisión de CO2 y la pregunta que me hacía es si es que has observado también las repercusiones o las consecuencias, cómo están distribuidas en este orden mundial. Es decir, vemos en los gráficos que me parecieron fascinantes, cómo se genera este movimiento de aceleración, donde hay algunos países o regiones que lideran esta aceleración. Y la pregunta es, ¿cómo no sé si has tenido la posibilidad de verlo, la distribución, repito, de las repercusiones de esta concentración de CO2? Es decir, ¿estas repercusiones llegan a la misma gente que las produce o son externalizadas, como para ocupar el concepto que ocupa Stefan Lesenich, ¿no? En el sentido de que aquellos que emiten el CO2 no son los que sufren de sus consecuencias en primera instancia, ¿no? ¿Hay algo, es posible ver eso o no es posible ver eso, ¿no? Climate change, etc. Esas serían como las dos preguntas. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias. Me pareció fascinante.
No, gracias a ti, Rafael. Rommy, ¿quieres hacer tu comentario también o contesto?
Yo creo que mejor respondes las dos preguntas de Rafael, que son bastante complejas, y luego yo voy con la mía.
Sí, sí, bien, entonces, gracias, Rafael. No es fácil contestar, pero voy a probar. Puede ser un poquito más fácil la segunda, porque aquí, de un lado, hay un efecto igualizador, puedes decir, con las emisiones, porque la concentración de carbón dióxido en la atmósfera es más o menos la misma alrededor de todo el planeta. Entonces, la desigualdad es más en la situación geográfica, como los pequeños estados islas, y también, pero también ciudades como Ámsterdam o Venecia. Pero en segundo luego, la capacidad de adaptarse, porque sigue ir adelante como es, hace falta adaptarse, ¿no? En todo el mundo. Y las sociedades ricas son más capaces de adaptarse. No están necesariamente en una mejor condición, porque hay desertificación en España, hay la subida del mar que toca Ámsterdam o Venecia. Entonces, la situación del impacto depende mucho de la climatología y de la geografía, pero la capacidad de adaptarse es muy desigual. Y hasta ahora las sociedades ricas no muestran ningún señal de compartir esta capacidad con otras sociedades, ¿no? Entonces la desigualdad en ese sentido es muy fuerte. Después, del otro lado, la desigualdad en la creación del problema. Claro que es muy variable. Puedo dar dos ejemplos del interior de Europa. Si miras, por ejemplo, esta fase de la grande aceleración occidental, del 45 al 75 más o menos del siglo XX, hay, por ejemplo, hay una gran dependencia creciente del carbón y del petróleo en sociedades como Italia y Alemania, Alemania Occidental en esta época. Pero, por ejemplo, en Francia y Suecia no lo hay, por dos razones muy diferentes. Son dos sociedades bastante ricas, donde hay crecimiento material del consumo. Pero en Suecia, ya desde el principio del siglo XX, la nueva energía es energía hídrica, porque lo tienen y bastante. Esto cambia solo con la motorización, cuando con el motor de combustión necesitas petróleo. Entonces, pero eso es en Suecia, son los años 60, 70. Y no hay una gran densidad de población. Entonces, la energía fósil hasta ahora no tiene un grande papel en Suecia, y también los suecos desarrollan las tecnologías renovables ahora. En Francia es diferente. Las élites francesas después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial saben muy bien que tienen relativamente poco carbón y casi nada de petróleo. Y en este momento ya tienen tienen una empresa petrolífera que sirve, pero son conscientes de esta problemática, y la solución allí es energía nuclear. La Francia es el país europeo que ha desarrollado la energía nuclear más que todos los otros. Gran Bretaña también, pero más que todos los otros. Entonces hay una desigualdad de contribución al problema ya desde el principio de la grande aceleración. Y esto también hace difícil la discusión política ahora. Se habla en general de la transición energética europea, pero hay muchas fricciones, ¿no? Porque hay países como ahora Polonia, que depende mucho del carbón aún, y son, hesitan mucho en, perdón, en acelerar la transición. Mientras Suecia y Francia dicen que claro que sí, vamos a hacerlo y tenemos las capacidades. Entonces, esto es un problema político importante. Yo he hablado de grandes regiones mundiales, pero al interior hay grandes diferencias, ¿no? Es la misma cosa por América Latina y también por el este de Asia, ¿no? Donde hay grandes diferencias al interior.
Muchas gracias, Peter. Bueno, voy a tomarme la palabra. Luego creo que alguien escribió una pregunta y la diré a continuación. Yo tengo, bueno, voy a utilizar la oportunidad de hacer las preguntas en castellano. Tengo dos preguntas que espero poder formularlas de manera sencilla, porque tienen que ver más como con un cuestionamiento quizás epistemológico, conceptual de la forma de abordar el problema del cambio climático y el calentamiento global. La primera tiene que ver con el concepto de antropoceno. Es un concepto que siempre me ha parecido muy interesante, se utiliza bastante en los estudios de extractivismo latinoamericano, pero me gustaría aprovechar la instancia de preguntarte a qué concepto podría ser un equivalente funcional en los conceptos que clásicamente se utilizan en la teoría social, ya que se intentó, por ejemplo, ponerlo en frente del concepto de sujeto, del materialismo histórico, eh, donde el individuo se enfrenta a la estructura social, ya sea histórica o la contingencia más institucional, política, económica, incluso cultural, y pierde autonomía, capacidad de agencia, pero a la vez la mantiene, ¿no? O el concepto de individuo, del individualismo metodológico que le da como más poder, paradójicamente, a un individuo, pero un individuo más liberal, menos colectivista. Entonces, claro, uno dentro de la sociología se mueve con cierta comodidad según el diagnóstico que quiera hacer por estos conceptos. Y aparece este concepto antropoceno que es a la vez muchas cosas, ¿no? Por un lado, la definición de una situación estructural de la humanidad, como que de pronto no somos conscientes de que la humanidad y la historia fue construida por los individuos, pero ya el hecho de ser una historia basada en el calentamiento global, en el cambio climático o en una problemática que ya no se presenta como un modelo institucional, como uno podría pensar en el capitalismo o la democracia, ¿no? Como esos grandes modelos que constantemente están en nuestro diagnóstico, sino que más bien es un modelo institucional, estructural, que determina la subjetividad, que además nos oprime y nos va a hacer desaparecer, básicamente. Entonces, quería como, no sé si me estoy yendo del tema, pero pedirte si podrías precisar el concepto en esa lógica, ¿no? Para no perdernos en qué es lo que explica el antropoceno, o sea, explica nuestra potencialidad transformadora radical, que a la vez la perdemos porque estamos inmersos en estos gráficos que bien mostraste que son bastante angustiantes, o sea, son fascinantes, pero son bastante angustiantes ver estas aceleraciones y estas subidas de curva, ¿no? Como entonces, ¿cuál es dentro del antropoceno y pensando también en tu teoría más general, dónde está la capacidad de agencia? ¿Dónde está la autonomía en esa definición más teórica de la idea de antropoceno? Y lo segundo tiene que ver con esto, pero es más quizás como general, es la idea del diagnóstico de la situación en que estamos en relación al cambio climático. Como que, claro, la teoría de Peter Wagner siempre se ha movido, ¿no? Por los diagnósticos políticos, socioeconómicos, históricos, comparados de la modernidad, pero al bajar a esta problemática de las transformaciones sociales ancladas a la realidad biofísica, la pregunta es, ¿hasta qué punto aparece una nueva dimensión en tu pensamiento, ¿no? Con esta realidad biofísica estructural, que ya no es una estructura social solamente, no es una estructura institucional histórica, sino que es la naturaleza, ¿no? Como ese engranaje que parece que nunca, que lo tuviésemos ahí, que Marx nos lo dijo claramente, que estábamos enajenados respecto a ella, pero, y que si bien otros teóricos más, como Bruno Latour, que de alguna manera nos dieron indicios de que había algo que también se relacionaba con nuestra humanidad, que no era totalmente externo, ¿cómo incorporas esto? Porque, o sea, ¿cómo lo incorporas también en esta dimensión más teórica? Porque, claro, uno de los diagnósticos es lo que está sucediendo a nivel de los cambios globales con el calentamiento global y la aceleración, pero por ejemplo, parece que también se nos viene una revolución con la inteligencia artificial, que probablemente va a ser algo similar, ¿no? Que también tiene su propia autonomía externa, no es estrictamente biofísica, pero sí es física y se transforma en las ciencias sociales, en una parte de esa estructura, de la estructura social, que ya no es solo social, ¿no? Bueno, son preguntas quizás muy abstractas, pero son las que me hago tratando de marcar tu maravillosa presentación en un framework más amplio de tu teoría.
Gracias, Rommy. Creo que voy a necesitar una hora más para la respuesta. Pero voy a probarlo en breve. Primero, el antropoceno. Vosotros sabéis que es un concepto geológico. Y los geólogos han decidido por ahora que no hace falta. Vivimos aún en el Holoceno. Por votación lo han decidido. Pero el problema aquí es, también creo que muchos de vosotros sabéis, había esta crítica que el concepto de antropoceno hace dos presuposiciones. El primero es que es la humanidad como especie que tiene este impacto, y el segundo es que lo hace igualmente. Y los dos, claro que no son verdad, no son ciertos. Pero yo, eso me ha siempre preocupado poco. Una alternativa propuesta era el capitaloceno, pero no me convence porque ya pone otra teoría que debes aceptar si utilizas este concepto. Y yo creo que hablar del ser humano, antropos, no quiere decir que es solo el ser humano y todos los seres humanos igualmente. Esto no es parte del concepto. Pero puede ser que los geólogos paran utilizar este concepto. Lo que está con nosotros es, que para mí es un hecho, que hay un impacto determinante de la acción humana sobre la condición de vida en el planeta. Y esto es, y por esto yo veo la conclusión importante diciendo que esto es así a partir de la segunda mitad del siglo XX. Entonces, sabéis probablemente también que había un debate muy grande, si es que empieza con la energía nuclear o que empieza con la máquina de vapor o que empieza con la primera revolución agricultural, con la deforestación que va con la agricultura. Pero esto para mí no tiene mucho sentido porque este impacto significativo no existe de verdad anterior a la mitad del siglo XX. Y esto es yo que he probado de demostrarlo en la presentación. Y esto es importante, creo, porque si es así, lo que nos ayuda es decir que está mucho más cerca que los otros acontecimientos históricos donde no hay mucho de hacer por estos ya es historia. Pero el impacto de la humanidad sobre el planeta es historia reciente y podemos analizar la agencia los que han definido los problemas y han propuesto soluciones que han creado este nuevo problema, que es el cambio climático. Todo este percurso histórico que os propongo es decir que, de hecho, cuando miramos la historia humana de larga duración, no vemos una lógica que se impone, un determinismo estructural de un tipo u otro, porque lo que vemos es problemas y definiciones de problemas y acciones en respuesta a estos problemas. Os doy un ejemplo más histórico. Por ejemplo, hay este debate sobre la grande divergencia de Kenneth Pomeranz, el historiador de la economía, que de hecho es experto de la China occidental. Y el argumento es que al final del siglo XVIII las condiciones sociales, políticas, institucionales y también de bienestar son bastante similares entre Europa Occidental y China y una región de China Occidental. Y entonces no hay un concepto que explique por qué hay el take-off en Inglaterra y no lo hay en China. Y lo que se puede decir que los chinos, eso se debe estudiar más, pero en un sentido tenían en esta zona al menos una economía orgánica avanzada como el oeste de Europa. Pero por una razón no han traspasado la primera frontera vertical con el carbón, como lo han hecho los ingleses. Y en este momento es una critical juncture, donde no quiero decir que alguien lo ha decidido, pero de interacciones se ha decidido de traspasar esta frontera en Inglaterra y no en China. Pero había en este momento la posibilidad de desarrollar más la economía orgánica, y ya estaba bastante avanzada. Y vemos también que la condición de vida en Europa se ha empeorado después con la industrialización por la mayoría de la población. Entonces no era una buena decisión, entre comillas, y había otras posibilidades en ese momento. Esto no podemos cambiar, pero podemos pensar sobre el presente en estos términos, de ver qué otras opciones tenemos con otras definiciones de los problemas. Y esto es, para mí, y creo que ahora voy de la primera a la segunda pregunta, que lo veo muy conectado. Pero esto para mí es en continuación del trabajo que he hecho anteriormente, porque siempre he probado de entender la modernidad del punto de vista de la autonomía, de la capacidad de acción, de agencia de los seres humanos, pero en contextos que ya existen. Entonces no libre en un sentido absoluto. Y la pluralidad de formas de modernidad son consecuencia de diferentes trayectorias en este sentido. Y debemos pensar sobre el presente en el mismo modo, las posibilidades de crear un futuro que rompe con la trayectoria de la energía fósil. Debo decir una cosa más porque se ha entendido bien. Es verdad que hay un problema con el concepto de autonomía. Hay críticos, Chacapati, como he dicho, pero también Latour y otros, y unos teóricos ahora, que dicen que debemos renunciar a este concepto porque autonomía implica ya la posibilidad de dominio sobre la naturaleza y explotación de la naturaleza. Pero históricamente no creo que es así. Si vemos los debates sobre la libertad y la autonomía en el siglo XVIII, vemos que también estas sociedades no han dominado la naturaleza, ¿no? Tenían catástrofes, desastres naturales cada unos años. Entonces nunca ha habido este concepto de autonomía absoluta y de dominación sobre la naturaleza, con la excepción de unos filósofos, pero en la sociedad en general no había. Y puede ser que es también más en la historia reciente donde emerge este concepto con más fuerza que antes. Y por esa razón no veo la necesidad, debemos ser más explícitos sobre las condiciones de la autonomía, del hecho que autonomía no quiere decir separarse de la naturaleza, porque somos naturaleza también nosotros. Pero esto no quiere decir que debemos renunciar al concepto de autonomía en general. No sé si he respuesto a todo.
Y de todas maneras. Muchas gracias. Rafa, yo estaba muy concentrada escuchando, no vi si había alguien.
Lucía Fernández tiene una pregunta y
Perfecto.
después también hay una pregunta en el chat de Guía Romero.
Lucía, tienes la palabra.
Gracias. Gracias por el seminario, gracias por la presentación. Es una excusa para volver a hablar con Peter un rato, que también fue tutor de mi máster. Ahora escuchándote se me venían algunas preguntas del escenario. En el chat apareció otra paisana argentina preocupada por lo que está pasando con la situación de la explotación de hidrocarburos en Argentina, pero el avance de nuevas fases de extractivismo vinculadas a la transición energética. Y es más una pregunta centrada en las respuestas que está pensando elaborar Europa frente al cambio climático, y si estás viendo esta intensificación de la relación con América Latina en búsqueda de recursos naturales que le permitan realizar esa transición energética, que en principio estaría orientada a reducir emisiones, pero que nosotros en América Latina estamos teniendo un incremento de las emisiones de carbón muy vinculada al incremento no solamente de las explotaciones de hidrocarburos que no se detienen, sino también al incremento de la minería, sobre todo para la provisión de cobre y de litio, que son fundamentales para las nuevas energías más de tipo eléctrica. Si podés ver ahí conflictos internos que se estén armando adentro de Europa alrededor de esta disputa por recursos más allá de las fronteras, e incluso también dentro de las fronteras y la relación entre las diferentes regiones de Europa. Nada más.
Hacemos la otra pregunta para juntar las dos que tienen el mismo punto central. Es la de, no sé si Gabriela, pero Romero, ¿no? ¿Te referías a ella? La colega que tenía una pregunta similar.
Creo que era llamada Gabriela, sí.
Sí, a ver. Sí. Se me mueve el chat y no lo veo. Un momento.
Está un poquito arriba.
Sí. A ver. ¿Tú la puedes leer, Rafa? Que se me...
Sí, yo la
no sé.
encontré acá. Bueno, tiene dos partes, ¿no? Como aquí comparte Gabriela, bueno, voy a comenzar a leer. En ese sentido que mencionan compañeros, lo traigo a la complejidad de mi territorio. Soy de Santa Cruz, al sur de la Patagonia Argentina, y aquí las multinacionales hacen estragos en términos ambientales y no aportan al desarrollo local, ni mucho menos a aminorar el daño. Entonces, nuestra zona totalmente atravesada por las dinámicas que propone el extractivismo y yo participo en investigaciones con foco en qué pasa con los movimientos sociales y su incidencia en la agenda estatal de políticas públicas, cuando como en ese mismo orden aquí solo tienen incidencia los sindicatos de trabajadores del rubro del petróleo antes que otros, ¿no? ¿Qué cree de ello? ¿Qué piensa usted sobre este problema?
Sí, ¿queréis que pruebo de contestar? Sí. Hola, Lucía, en primer lugar. No te veo, pero es bien escucharte. Em, yo, de la perspectiva que he probado de desarrollar, lo veo, prefiero de mirar estos situaciones actuales, y tenéis razón, ¿no? Claro, los dos, como consecuencia de asimetrías de poder, más que directamente de una lógica capitalista. Es decir, si vuelvo para explicar al principio de los años 70, cuando las sociedades occidentales se han visto confrontado con esta crisis múltipla, ahora es evidente que han intentado de resolver esta crisis desplazando los problemas en otras regiones del mundo. Los problemas ecológicos y los problemas sociales en otras regiones del mundo y también en el futuro. Eso lo vemos hoy con el cambio climático. Y lo han hecho de una situación de poder, es decir, de ser capaz de hecho, de hacerlo, de desplazar el impacto de la solución de los problemas en otras regiones. Eso, Rafael, eso es lo que dice Lessig en su libro también. Pero ahora vemos que en el curso del último medio siglo, del 70 hasta ahora, que esto también ha hecho las sociedades occidentales más frágiles. Y esto lo vemos ahora, la transición energética, que es más un nombre de publicidad que una realidad, es una reacción a nuevas dependencias económicas de China y también políticas militares, como vemos ahora con Rusia. Entonces, yo veo más que una continuidad de la dominación occidental capitalista, yo veo que el Occidente en general es más débil en la confrontación occidental sobre estos problemas. Esto es no decir que no tienen capacidad de desplazar aún los problemas. Y esto, lo que decís vosotros, la más grande brutalidad del extractivismo es quizás también una consecuencia de la fragilidad occidental. No, cuando había el debate sobre el nuevo orden económico internacional en los años 70, el Occidente al menos retóricamente ha aceptado esta propuesta y después no lo han hecho en consecuencia con ese desplazamiento. Ahora tampoco lo dicen, ¿no? Si vemos, por ejemplo, vuelvo al cambio climático, que hay debates cada año y los fondos para los países más tocados por el cambio climático no existen aún. O ahora existe el fondo, pero no hay dinero. Entonces, sigue este intento de desplazar, de seguir vivir como, como siempre en Occidente, o hace mucho en Occidente, pero la capacidad no es la misma. Y entonces el problema de fondo es cómo vivimos en un mundo muy desigual socialmente, pero también en términos de poder. ¿Cómo podemos llegar a un punto donde los poderes fácticos no podemos restringir su capacidad de acción? Y el riesgo es, cuando son más débiles, son más brutales. Y creo que esto lo vemos ahora. Pero el problema persiste, ¿qué hacemos? ¿Cómo vamos a cambiar la situación y crear una situación más simétrica en términos de poderes? Vuelvo a otro ejemplo histórico. La particularidad de la Europa al final del siglo XIX era la fuerza del movimiento obrero, que tenía un otro tipo de propuesta por un cambio radical. Esta revolución socialista del cual hablaba Schumpeter después. Pero no tenían la capacidad de hacerlo de verdad, de hacerlo realidad, por la resistencia de los poderes. Y la conclusión en este momento era el totalitarismo. Con más grande fuerza del movimiento obrero, hay una reacción más brutal de los poderes. Y cómo gestionar este conflicto en un modo que llegamos a una situación mejor y con más simetría de los poderes, sin brutalizar la situación. Esto es aún no hay una respuesta histórica a este problema, creo. Vivimos más una radicalización de esta problemática ahora. Cuando, por ejemplo, si ves, vuelvo a la transición energética de Lucía, que ahora se habla siempre más que un camino sin salida en Europa por la transición energética, por la reacción en la sociedad con la extrema derecha antiecológica. Aquí ves también que en un momento cuando no puedes más negar el cambio climático, los intereses en la energía fósil se radicalizan. Sencillamente dicen que no lo hacemos. Podéis hablar de transición energética, pero no lo hacemos, continuamos. Y esto es un final de debate que brutaliza la situación.
Gracias.
¿Alguna otra pregunta en el chat?
Me parece la última, ¿no? Hay una de Oscar Julián.
Además, un comentario. Le preguntaba a Oscar si quería hacerla a él, porque yo entiendo que es un comentario más que una pregunta. Creo que no hay más preguntas.
A mí me gustaría hacer una última, pero así de
Goloso.
goloso, de goloso, de sobremesa, como dirían, si es que se puede.
Claro.
Que, a propósito del comentario que hacía acá Oscar Julián respecto de la diversidad de modos energéticos, planteaba y que, bueno, siempre se van generando emisiones, más allá de que lo que no podemos olvidar es que hay algunos modos energéticos que generan mucho más que otros, etcétera. Pero quería llevarte más bien a la parte de creatividad, ¿no? Porque Limits to Growth, que es una obra extraordinaria, más allá de que con los años siempre fue objeto de refutación o de crítica por intereses creados o no, digamos, pero ya se cumplieron ahora 50 años, hace 2 años, ¿no? De ese libro que, como digo, me parece fascinante. Em, eh, los autores del Club de Roma entiendo que escribieron algunos años después un reporte donde decían que los pronósticos habían sido demasiado conservadores, es decir, de que la realidad se había comido, justo en el momento de la aceleración que nos describe, salía este libro, y que la realidad se había comido el pronóstico, es decir, era aún más rápido de lo que ellos calculaban. Entonces, sabiendo que la sociología, las ciencias sociales, se abstienen de generar pronósticos porque nosotros más bien miramos lo que ocurre, sacamos conclusiones, pero nos abstenemos un poco de jugar el rol de profeta. Quería igualmente en esta pregunta de sobremesa llevarte un poco a ese ropaje creativo. ¿Cómo ves tú, a propósito de las tendencias que nos has descrito, de tu perspectiva, que se va a desarrollar esto o qué línea va a seguir esto en los próximos 20, 30, 40, 50 años, digamos? ¿Cómo lo ves ahora mismo el momento en virtud de todas las además de estas policrisis que conviven junto con el problema ecológico? Eso sería un poco.
Muchas gracias, Rafael. Digo primero algo sobre el Club de Roma, porque esto no sé cómo se traduce normalmente, pero vosotros sabéis que Robert Merton, el sociólogo estadounidense, hablaba ya en los años 30 de la self-fulfilling prophecy, una profecía que se autocumple. Y también, un poquito más tarde, creo, si me acuerdo bien, decía que hay también la self-defeating prophecy, la profecía que se autoanula. Y esto es un concepto muy interesante. Yo creo que más que el informe del Club de Roma es una profecía que se autoanula en el sentido que habla de los límites de los recursos naturales, con modelos, con números, con todo esto. Pero la reacción a medio término era decir que no aceptamos estos límites. Vamos a buscar más, desarrollar nuevas técnicas de extracción, como el fracking para el petróleo, y entonces esos límites no existen, como ha dicho el informe, vamos a autoanularlo. Y esto es la problemática de un diagnóstico crítico de las ciencias sociales, porque también atrae la atención de los que están criticados. Y si lo toman en serio, van a pensar, ¿qué podemos hacer para autoanular esta diagnóstico? Y creo que esto también está acabando ahora con el cambio climático, que hay más de un aspecto. Las análisis apocalípticas, eso es otro problema, creo. Pero si miras al diagnóstico oficial del IPCC, creo que se ve bastante bien que, de un lado, esto ha creado esta conciencia mundial de la urgencia y los movimientos ecológicos. Pero del otro lado, también han entendido los intereses en las energías fósiles que deben reaccionar a esto, porque si no, se escapa de su control. Y eso es lo que pasa ahora. Es una lucha, en primer lugar, sobre la interpretación del problema, que estábamos ganando nosotros, pero ahora ya hay una reacción bastante fuerte. Y la reacción es posible porque el cambio de interpretación hasta ahora no ha tenido ningún efecto sobre los poderes políticos y económicos, o ningún efecto sobre los poderes económicos y efectos limitados sobre los poderes políticos, donde hay algo, ¿no? Se ven unos gobiernos que son más ecologistas que otros, entonces un efecto político hay, pero es demasiado débil, y un efecto con los poderes económicos casi no hay. Hay mentira, ¿no? Ecopostureo y poco más, casi nada más. Y entonces, pero esto es la lucha, ¿no? Hay estos tres aspectos. La interpretación del problema, que es el principio y se puede decir el más fundamental. Y pero no es suficiente. Si después este cambio de interpretación no tiene impacto sobre las constelaciones de poderes, no cambia mucho. Y esto lo veo, como me has preguntado sobre los 30, 40 años del futuro, es esto que está pasando, ¿no? Tenemos estas luchas de poderes en estos tres sentidos, que son muy asimétricas. Y en este momento no soy muy optimista, pero seguimos luchando. No hay nada otro que hacer.
Excelente. Hay un comentario que dice que ecopostureo es un gran concepto. Sí, estoy de acuerdo. Estoy de acuerdo con eso. Bueno, yo creo que no hay más preguntas. Rafa, confirmo contigo.
Sí, yo no veo más.
Sí, bueno, dan ganas de seguir debatiendo. Pero bueno, ya llevamos 2 horas de seminario y si viene un espacio relajado y de tranquilidad para los debates, creo que el viernes y quizás también queremos ir con la familia o a descansar
Sería
un
bien
poquito,
ir a un sitio y tomar
a
algo,
tomar
pero
algo y preguntar, sí,
no
porque
es
a mí
A
ya
ver
se
el
me
inicio
acabó.
de la Eurocopa.
O preguntar sobre los ODS, que es una pregunta que me quedó ahí como... pero bueno, podemos seguir debatiendo. Eh, Reiterar el agradecimiento profundo, Peter, por aceptar la invitación que ya hicimos hace muchísimo tiempo. Fuiste uno de los primeros invitados al seminario, eso es importante mencionarlo. Eh, Agradecer a la audiencia que se conectó. Y bueno, que algunos entienden bien inglés, otros no tanto, pero el tema era tan interesante y tu presencia también, que creo que eso fue algo secundario. Agradecer a las personas que se conectaron de algunos territorios que no habían estado antes presentes en el seminario, como Sudáfrica, mis queridas Sudáfrica, y Sam, que está en un lugar privilegiado del mundo tan bonito como Cape Town. Y bueno, con muchas ganas de seguir debatiendo, agradezco en nombre del grupo que organizamos este seminario y dejamos a todas y a todos invitados para el próximo, que como siempre no sabemos cuándo va a ser la fecha exacta, pero dentro de un mes más o menos. Y Peter, bueno, muy agradecida en lo personal de tu disposición y como siempre muy fascinante escucharte. Así que un abrazo a todas y subiremos luego el vídeo para que lo puedan, para aquellos que nos preguntaban por subtítulos, eso que tampoco somos tan tecnológicos, que ya ahí puedan poner subtítulos o lo que quieran para poder volver a escuchar la presentación. Un abrazo a todas y buen fin de semana.
Muchas gracias a vosotros, Rommy, Rafael, y a todos que han asistido. Un gran placer y seguimos con la discusión. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas
Adiós.
gracias, Peter. Y gracias a todos y a todas.